The night my neighbor called the cops because she thought I was running an illegal bonfire in my backyard was the same night I realized I had made a terrible mistake moving into Willowbrook Estates in Henderson, Nevada. I had spent the better part of 3 hours that Friday evening grilling burgers and sitting around my brand new fire pit with a couple of friends from work, enjoying the cool desert air that September brings to the Las Vegas suburbs. The fire pit was a beautiful copper number I had picked up from a specialty outdoor store in nearby Boulder City, complete with a mesh screen to catch sparks and a sturdy base that kept it elevated and safe. I had researched local fire codes, checked the weather for wind conditions, and even swept my small patio clean of any debris that could catch fire. I was being responsible, or so I thought. My name is Trevor Anderson, and I am a 34-year-old software developer who had just closed on my first home 3 months prior. The house was a modest 3-bedroom ranch-style property with a decent-sized backyard, perfect for someone like me who enjoyed outdoor entertaining but did not need anything extravagant. The neighborhood seemed quiet when I toured it, with well-maintained lawns and friendly-looking people walking their dogs. What I did not realize was that Willowbrook Estates was governed by one of the most aggressive homeowners associations in Clark County, and that the president of said association lived directly across the street from me. Her name was Patricia Montgomery, though everyone called her Patty, and she was the textbook definition of what the internet had taught me to call a Karen. She was 52 years old, had that signature "can I speak to the manager" haircut dyed an unnatural shade of blonde, and drove a white Lexus SUV with a custom license plate that read Hopres. I should have known from that license plate alone that my life was about to become significantly more complicated. The cops showed up around 9:30 that night, just as my friends Mike and Danny were getting ready to leave. We had let the fire die down to embers, and I was using my fire poker to spread out the remaining wood so everything would burn out safely. The doorbell rang, and I walked through my house to find 2 Henderson police officers standing on my front porch, looking somewhat apologetic. "Evening, sir," the taller one said. His name tag read Officer Ramirez. "We got a call about an illegal fire in your backyard. Mind if we take a look?" I blinked in confusion. "Illegal fire? I have a fire pit. It's perfectly legal." The other officer, a younger woman named Officer Chen, glanced at her notepad. "The caller said you were burning debris and creating a hazard. We just need to verify everything is up to code." I led them through my house and out to the backyard, where Mike and Danny were standing awkwardly by the now dying fire pit. Officer Ramirez walked around the fire pit, examined it from a few angles, and then nodded. "This looks fine to me," he said. "You are using a commercial fire pit with proper screening. You are on a concrete pad and there is no debris burning. You are within code." "So we are good?" I asked. "You are good," Officer Chen confirmed. "Sorry for the inconvenience. We have to respond to all calls." As the officers left, I noticed Patty Montgomery standing in her driveway, arms crossed, watching everything with an expression of deep disapproval. I waved at her, trying to be friendly despite the fact that she had just wasted everyone's time by calling the police. She did not wave back. The following Monday, I found a letter in my mailbox. It was printed on official Willowbrook Estates HOA letterhead and was addressed to me in bold, capital letters. The letter informed me that I was in violation of HOA Code Section 7.4, which prohibited open flames in residential yards. There was a $1,500 fine attached, and I was given 7 days to remove the fire pit or face additional penalties. I read the letter 3 times, my blood pressure rising with each pass. I had reviewed the HOA documents when I bought the house. They were long and tedious, but I had specifically looked for any restrictions on fire pits because I knew I wanted one. I had not seen anything prohibiting them. I dug out my copy of the HOA covenant and started reading through it again, this time with a highlighter and a notepad. It took me nearly 2 hours, but I finally found section 7.4. It read, in part, that open burning of yard debris was prohibited. Nothing about fire pits. Nothing about recreational fires. Just yard debris. The next evening, I walked across the street to Patty's house and rang her doorbell. She answered with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Trevor," she said, drawing out my name like it was something distasteful. "What can I do for you?" "I got your letter," I said, holding it up. "But I think there has been a misunderstanding. I am not burning yard debris. I have a fire pit." "Fire pits create open flames," Patty said, her smile vanishing. "Open flames are prohibited." "The code says open burning of yard debris is prohibited," I corrected. "A recreational fire pit is not the same thing." Patty's face hardened. "As HOA president, I interpret the codes, and I interpret this as prohibiting your fire pit. You have 7 days. "This is ridiculous," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I bought this house 3 months ago. If fire pits were prohibited, that should have been disclosed." "7 days, Trevor," Patty repeated, and then she closed the door in my face. I spent the next day consulting with a real estate attorney named Jessica Turner, whose office was located in a strip mall off Sunset Road. She reviewed my HOA documents and the letter from Patty. "This is a stretch," Jessica said, tapping the letter with her pen. "The covenant clearly refers to yard debris burning, not recreational fires. But HOAs have a lot of leeway in interpreting their own rules. Fighting this could cost you more in legal fees than the fine itself." "So what do I do?" I asked. "You have a few options," Jessica said. "You can pay the fine and get rid of the fire pit. You can fight it and potentially end up in a long legal battle. Or you can look for a creative solution that technically complies with their interpretation while still letting you enjoy outdoor fires." That last option stuck with me. A creative solution. I went home and started researching. If Patty wanted to interpret open flames as prohibited, then maybe I needed something that was not technically an open flame. That was when I discovered chimeneas. A chimenea, I learned, was a type of outdoor fireplace with Mexican origins. Unlike a fire pit, which is open on top, a chimenea is enclosed with a chimney that directs smoke upward. Technically, the flame is not open because it is contained within the structure. It was perfect. I found a beautiful cast iron chimenea at a home improvement store in Las Vegas, near the IKEA off South Grand Central Parkway. It stood about 4 feet tall, had a classic bulbous shape, and was rated for wood burning. I loaded it into my truck and brought it home that same afternoon. Setting up the chimenea took less than an hour. I placed it on the same concrete pad where my fire pit had been, making sure it was stable and away from any overhanging branches or structures. That evening, I invited Mike and Danny back over, and we christened the new chimenea with some seasoned oak wood and a few beers. The fire burned beautifully, the chimney directing the smoke straight up into the night sky. We sat around the patio, enjoying the warmth and the ambience, and I felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that I had found a way around Patty's unreasonable rule. The satisfaction lasted exactly 18 hours. The next morning, there was another letter in my mailbox. This one informed me that I was now in violation of HOA Code Section 7.4 and Section 9.2, which prohibited structures over 3 feet tall without prior approval. The fine had increased to $3,000. I called Jessica Turner immediately. "She cannot do this," I said, barely containing my anger. "This is harassment." "You have the receipt for the Chimenea?" Jessica asked. "And did you check if it required approval?" I pulled out the receipt and scanned through the HOA documents again. Section 9.2 did exist, and it did require approval for structures over 3 feet tall. But there was a list of exceptions, including decorative lawn items, garden ornaments, and outdoor furniture. "Could a chimenea be considered a decorative lawn item?" I asked Jessica. "Possibly," she said, "but that is going to be another interpretation issue. Look, Trevor, I think it is time to escalate this. Request a hearing with the HOA board. You have the right to contest these fines in front of the full board, not just the president." I filed the request that afternoon. According to the HOA bylaws, the board had to schedule a hearing within 30 days. In the meantime, the fines were on hold. 3 weeks later, I found myself sitting in the community center at the edge of Willowbrook Estates, facing a panel of 5 HOA board members. Patty sat in the center, flanked by 2 older men and 2 middle-aged women. There were about a dozen other residents in the room, apparently there to watch the proceedings. "Mr. Anderson," Patty began, shuffling papers in front of her. "You are here to contest fines levied against you for violations of HOA Codes 7.4 and 9.2. Is that correct?" "It is," I said, standing up. I had prepared a whole speech, printed out relevant code sections, and even brought photos of my chimenea. "I believe these fines are unjustified and based on incorrect interpretations of the HOA covenant." "Please present your case," Patty said, her tone making it clear she had already made up her mind. I walked through my argument methodically. I explained that Section 7.4 clearly referred to yard debris, not recreational fires. I pointed out that fire pits and chimeneas were common in Henderson and throughout Nevada, and that banning them was unusually restrictive. I then addressed Section 9.2, arguing that a chimenea was a decorative outdoor item, similar to a large planter or a garden statue, and should fall under the listed exceptions. One of the older men on the board, whose name plate identified him as Harold Chen, leaned forward. "Mr. Anderson, does your chimenea produce smoke?" "Yes," I said. "It is a wood-burning chimenea. Smoke goes up through the chimney." "And does this smoke bother your neighbors?" Harold asked. "I have not received any complaints from my neighbors," I said, "except from Mrs. Montgomery, who called the police on my fire pit despite it being perfectly legal." Patty's face flushed. "That is irrelevant. The smoke is a nuisance." "To whom?" I challenged. "My backyard is fenced. The chimenea is positioned away from property lines. The smoke dissipates quickly." "This is not about smoke. This is about you trying to control what I do on my own property." The room went silent. One of the middle-aged women on the board, whose name plate reads Susan Martinez, cleared her throat. "Mrs. Montgomery, I have to say, I am not sure I understand the basis for these fines. My husband and I have a fire pit in our backyard. Are we in violation too?" Patty looked flustered. "That is different. Your fire pit has been there since before the current interpretation." "Current interpretation," Susan repeated. "Since when?" "Since I determined it was necessary," Patty snapped. The other board members exchanged glances. Harold Chen spoke up again. "Mrs. Montgomery, I think we need to table this discussion and review the covenant language more carefully. Mr. Anderson makes valid points." "We do not need to table anything," Patty insisted. "I have the authority as president to interpret these codes." "With board approval," Susan said firmly, "which you do not have. I move to dismiss these fines pending a full board review of the relevant code sections." Another board member, a quiet man named Robert Torres, seconded the motion. When the vote was called, it was 4-1 in favor of dismissing the fines. Only Patty voted against it. I walked out of that community center feeling vindicated. Mike and Danny came over that weekend to celebrate, and we fired up the Chimenea once again. But I knew this was not over. Patty Montgomery was not the type to accept defeat gracefully. I was right. Over the next 2 months, I received no fewer than 8 additional letters from the HOA. I was cited for my grass being a 1/4 inch too long, even though I had mowed it the day before. I was cited for parking my truck in my driveway overnight, despite there being no rule against it. I was cited for having a garden hose visible from the street, for having my trash cans out 30 minutes past the pickup time, and for having a wreath on my front door that was apparently not in keeping with the neighborhood aesthetic. Each citation came with a fine ranging from $200 to $500. I contested every single one, and every single one was dismissed by the board at subsequent hearings. But the harassment was taking its toll. I was spending hours documenting everything, taking photos, keeping records, and attending meetings. It was exhausting. Other neighbors started approaching me. I learned that I was not the only one Patty had targeted. A woman named Linda Grayson, who lived 2 streets over, had been fined repeatedly for having a vegetable garden in her backyard that Patty claimed was visible from the street through a gap in the fence. A young couple named Kevin and Andrea Park had been cited for having Christmas lights up past January 1st, even though they had taken them down on December 30th. And the citation was dated January 2nd. We started meeting informally, sharing stories and strategies. It became clear that Patty had a pattern of targeting people she personally disliked or who had challenged her authority. The more we talked, the more we realized something else. The fines that Patty collected went into the HOA General Fund, which she had sole authority to manage as president. That raised a question. What was Patty doing with all that money? Kevin Park, who worked as an accountant, volunteered to dig into the HOA financial records. As homeowners, we had the right to request these records, though the process was bureaucratic and slow. It took 6 weeks, but Kevin finally received copies of the HOA bank statements and expense reports for the past 3 years. What he found was disturbing. The HOA had collected over $200,000 in fines over the past 3 years. That was an astronomical number for a neighborhood of only 150 homes. But what was even more concerning was where that money had gone. There were dozens of expenses labeled as administrative costs, community improvements, and landscaping fees. But when Kevin Cross referenced these expenses with actual work done in the neighborhood, the numbers did not add up. For example, there was a $50,000 expense for repainting the community center. But several neighbors confirmed that the community center had not been repainted. There was a $30,000 expense for new playground equipment in the neighborhood park, but the playground equipment was the same as it had been for years. Kevin brought his findings to the rest of us, and we all came to the same conclusion. Patty was embezzling from the HOA. This was no longer just about annoying fines and petty harassment. This was fraud. We needed to handle this carefully. I called Jessica Turner again and explained what we had found. She recommended we hire a forensic accountant to do a thorough audit before making any accusations. She also recommended we report our findings to the Nevada Real Estate Division, which had oversight over HOAs in the state. We pooled our resources and hired a forensic accountant named Martin Lee, who had experience with HOA fraud cases. Martin spent 3 weeks going through every transaction, every receipt, and every bank statement. His final report was damning. Martin determined that Patty had siphoned approximately $175,000 from the HOA over 3 years. She had done this through a combination of fake invoices, inflated expenses, and direct transfers to personal accounts disguised as reimbursements. Some of the money had been used to pay for personal vacations, home renovations, and even a new car. We submitted Martin's report to the Nevada Real Estate Division and also sent copies to the other HOA board members. Within days, the board called an emergency meeting. The meeting was packed. Nearly every homeowner in Willowbrook Estates showed up, having heard through the neighborhood grapevine that something big was happening. Patty sat at the head table, looking pale and nervous. Harold Chen opened the meeting. We have received credible allegations of financial misconduct involving HOA funds. Mrs. Montgomery, as president, you have the right to respond to these allegations. Patty stood up, her hands shaking. This is a witch hunt. These accusations are completely false. I have done nothing wrong. Susan Martinez held up a copy of Martin's report. This is a forensic audit conducted by a licensed accountant. It details $175,000 in fraudulent transactions. How do you explain this? I do not have to explain anything to you, Patty said, her voice rising. I am the president of this HOA. You have no authority to question me. Actually, we do, Robert Torres said quietly. As board members, we have a fiduciary duty to the homeowners, and right now the evidence suggests you have been stealing from us. The room erupted in angry murmurs. People shouted questions at Patty, demanding answers. She tried to speak over the noise, but her voice was drowned out. Finally, Harold banged a gavel on the table. Order. We need order. He turned to Patty. Mrs. Montgomery, I am calling for a vote to suspend you as president pending a full investigation. All in favor? 4 hands went up immediately. Patty stared at them in disbelief. You cannot do this, she said, her voice cracking. You cannot just remove me. We just did, Susan said. You are suspended, effective immediately. Please surrender all HOA records, keys, and bank access information to Harold by the end of the week. Patty grabbed her purse and stormed out of the community center, nearly knocking over a chair on her way out. The room broke into applause. But the story did not end there. 2 days after the meeting, I was sitting in my backyard, enjoying a fire in my Chimenea, when I saw police cars pull up to Patty's house across the street. I watched as 2 detectives knocked on her door and, after a brief conversation, led her out in handcuffs. I later learned that the Nevada Real Estate Division had forwarded Martin's report to the Henderson Police Department, which had opened a criminal investigation. Patty was arrested on multiple counts of theft, embezzlement, and fraud. The amounts involved pushed the charges into felony territory. The case moved slowly through the court system, as these things do. But over the following months, more details emerged. Patty had been skimming from the HOA almost from the moment she became president 5 years earlier. She had started small, with a few $100s here and there, but had grown bolder over time. The fake invoices, the inflated expenses, and the personal reimbursements had all been carefully documented by Martin. Patty's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the district attorney was not interested. The case went to trial, and I was called to testify about the harassment I had experienced and the fines that had been levied against me and others. Kevin Park testified about the financial irregularities he had discovered. Martin Lee walked the jury through his forensic audit, explaining in clear terms how Patty had stolen from the community. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Patty was sentenced to 6 years in the Nevada Department of Corrections, and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. Her house was eventually sold to cover part of the restitution, and the HOA recovered about 60% of the stolen funds. It was not everything, but it was something. In the aftermath, the HOA board underwent a complete restructuring. Susan Martinez was elected as the new president, and she immediately set about reforming the bylaws and creating more transparency around financial management. One of her first acts was to officially clarify Section 7.4 of the Covenant, stating explicitly that recreational fire pits and chimeneas were permitted as long as they complied with local fire codes. I kept my chimenea. In fact, it became something of a symbol in the neighborhood. Other homeowners started buying their own fire pits and chimeneas, and it was not uncommon to see smoke rising from backyards on cool evenings. We started having informal neighborhood gatherings where people would bring chairs and drinks and gather around whoever happened to be hosting that night. The sense of community that had been stifled under Patty's authoritarian rule began to flourish. People felt free to use their properties as they saw fit, within reason. The HOA still existed and still enforced sensible rules about property maintenance and neighborhood aesthetics, but the pettiness and harassment were gone. About a year after Patty's sentencing, I was sitting around my chimenea with Mike, Danny, Linda Grayson, and Kevin and Andrea Park. We were roasting marshmallows and talking about how much things had changed. "I still cannot believe she thought she could get away with it," Andrea said, shaking her head. $175,000. That is insane. Greed makes people do crazy things, Kevin said. "She probably thought no one would ever check." "I am just glad it is over," Linda said. "I can finally enjoy my vegetable garden without worrying about getting fined." Mike raised his beer. "Here is to Trevor and his chimenea." Without you pushing back, who knows how long Patty would have kept this up? We all clinked our bottles together, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Standing up to Patty had been exhausting and stressful, but it had been worth it. Not just for me, but for everyone in Willowbrook Estates. The legal proceedings had taken nearly 18 months from start to finish, but justice had been served. Patty's mugshot had made the local news, and Henderson had become a cautionary tale in HOA management circles. The Nevada Real Estate Division had even used our case as an example in training materials for HOA board members, emphasizing the importance of financial oversight and accountability. Susan Martinez proved to be an excellent HOA president. She instituted quarterly financial reports that were distributed to all homeowners, created a system of checks and balances that required multiple board members to approve large expenses, and established an ombudsman position to handle complaints fairly. The changes were not flashy, but they were effective. I continued to live in my house in Willowbrook Estates, enjoying my backyard and my chimenea without fear of arbitrary fines or harassment. The neighborhood felt like an actual community now, rather than a place where everyone kept their heads down and avoided drawing attention. One evening in late spring, about 2 years after the whole ordeal began, I was lighting up my chimenea when my doorbell rang. I walked through the house and opened the door to find an older couple standing on my porch. They looked vaguely familiar, but I could not place them. "Can I help you?" I asked. "Hi," the man said. "We are the Johnsons. We are closing on the Montgomery house next week and wanted to introduce ourselves." The Montgomery house. Patty's old house across the street. "Oh, welcome to the neighborhood," I said, shaking their hands. "I am Trevor. We have heard a lot about what happened with the previous owner, Mrs. Johnson said carefully. "We wanted to make sure the HOA situation was better now before we finalized everything." I laughed. "It is much better. The new board is great. You will like it here." "That is good to hear," Mr. Johnson said. "We noticed you have a fire pit in your backyard." "Are those allowed?" "It is a chimenea, actually," I said. "And yes, they are definitely allowed. You should get one. We have neighborhood gatherings around them all the time." The Johnsons smiled, looking relieved. We chatted for a few more minutes before they headed back to their car. As I watched them drive away, I thought about how close I had come to just giving up and paying those initial fines. If I had done that, Patty would still be in power, still be stealing, and still be making everyone's lives miserable. The fire pit that started this whole mess was long gone, donated to a friend who lived outside HOA jurisdiction. But the chimenea remained, a testament to the fact that sometimes you have to get creative when dealing with unreasonable people. More importantly, it was a reminder that standing up to bullies, even when it is exhausting and frustrating, is worth it in the end. I walked back through my house and out to the patio, where the fire in the chimenea was crackling nicely. I settled into my chair, opened a cold beer, and looked up at the stars appearing in the darkening Nevada sky. My phone buzzed with a text from Mike asking if they could come over, and I replied that the fire was already going. Within 30 minutes, my backyard was full of friends and neighbors, all gathered around the warmth of the chimenea. Someone had brought burgers to grill. Someone else had brought a portable speaker and was playing music. Kids were running around the yard, and adults were laughing and telling stories. This was what a neighborhood was supposed to feel like. Not oppressive rules and constant surveillance, but people coming together and enjoying each other's company. And it had all started because I refused to let Patty Montgomery tell me I could not have a fire in my own backyard. Susan Martinez showed up around 8 with her husband Carlos, carrying a case of beer and a big smile. She had become a good friend over the past 2 years, and I appreciated everything she had done to reform the HOA. "Great turnout tonight," she said, handing me a beer. "It usually is these days," I said. "People actually want to be here now." "That is how it should be," Susan agreed. I got the final restitution check from Patty's attorney last week, by the way. With that and the money from selling her house, we have recovered about 70% of what she took. "That is better than I expected," I said. "Me too." We are going to use it to finally do some of those community improvements she claimed to have done. Real improvements this time. We stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, watching people enjoy themselves. Then Susan nudged me with her elbow. "You know, none of this would have happened if you had just gotten rid of your fire pit like she demanded." I looked at the chimenea, flames dancing through the opening, smoke rising peacefully into the night air. "Good thing I switched to a chimenea then," I said. Susan laughed, and we clinked our bottles together. The party went on for hours, as these gatherings often did. People came and went, and the fire in the chimenea burned steadily, providing warmth and light and a focal point for the community that had formed around it. I stayed up late, long after most people had gone home, tending the fire and thinking about everything that had happened. It was funny how something as simple as wanting to enjoy a fire in your backyard could lead to uncovering a massive fraud scheme. But that was the thing about standing up to bullies and tyrants. Once you started pulling on that thread, you never knew what would unravel. Patty Montgomery was sitting in a prison cell in Clark County, and she would be there for several more years. The neighborhood she had terrorized was thriving without her. And I was sitting in my backyard, exactly where I wanted to be, doing exactly what I wanted to do. The chimenea crackled and popped, sending a column of sparks up into the darkness. I added another piece of wood and settled back into my chair, feeling more content than I had in a long time. Sometimes the best revenge is not getting even. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and knowing that justice was served. As the fire burned down to embers and the night grew late, I finally went inside, making sure to properly extinguish the remaining coals in the chimney as I always did. Safety first, even when there was no longer an HOA president looking for reasons to fine me. The next morning, I woke up to find another notice in my mailbox, and my heart sank for just a moment before I remembered that Patty was gone. I pulled out the envelope and opened it to find an invitation to the HOA annual meeting, where Susan would be presenting the plans for the community improvements funded by the recovered restitution money. There was also going to be a vote on several proposed bylaw changes, all aimed at preventing future abuses of power. I marked the date on my calendar and went about my day, heading to work at the software company where I was now leading a team of developers. Life had returned to normal, or perhaps to a new and better normal. My house was my sanctuary again, not a source of stress and conflict. That weekend, I decided to do some work in my backyard. I built a small stone patio around the chimney, creating a more permanent and attractive setup for gatherings. Several neighbors stopped by to watch and offer advice, and before long it turned into an impromptu work party with multiple people helping to lay stones and level the ground. This was the kind of community involvement that actually mattered. People helping each other, working together on projects, building relationships. Not a power-hungry HOA president inventing violations and collecting fines. Linda Grayson brought over some vegetables from her garden, which had flourished now that she did not have to worry about citations. Kevin Park helped me figure out the best pattern for laying the stones. Andrea brought lemonade and sandwiches. It was a perfect afternoon. As we worked, Harold Chen stopped by. He was no longer on the HOA board, having stepped down after Susan took over, but he remained active in the community. "Looking good," he said, surveying our work. "Much better than just having it sit on concrete." "Thanks," I said. "Figured I might as well make it nice since I am not going anywhere," Harold chuckled. "I am glad you stuck it out. A lot of people would have just moved after dealing with what Patty put you through." "I thought about it," I admitted, "but I liked the house, and I did not want to let her win." "Well, you did not just not let her win," Harold said. "You exposed her for what she was. The whole neighborhood owes you for that." I felt a bit embarrassed by the praise, but I appreciated it. The truth was, I had not set out to be some crusader against HOA corruption. I had just wanted to have a fire pit in my backyard. Everything else had followed from that simple desire. The annual HOA meeting took place 3 weeks later in the community center, and it was nothing like the contentious meetings during Patty's reign. Susan presented the financial reports clearly and thoroughly, showing exactly where every dollar had come from and where it had gone. There were no hidden expenses, no mysterious administrative costs, no inflated invoices. The proposed bylaw changes were voted on and passed nearly unanimously. From now on, no single person would have unilateral authority over HOA finances. All expenses over $500 would require approval from at least 3 board members. All financial records would be posted online for homeowners to review at any time. And there would be an annual independent audit conducted by a third-party accounting firm. These were common-sense reforms that should have been in place from the beginning, but better late than never. The meeting ended with applause and a sense that the community had truly turned a corner. As people filed out, Susan pulled me aside. "I wanted to thank you again," she said. "Seriously, what you did took guts and it made a real difference." "I just did not want to pay a bogus fine," I said with a shrug. "Maybe that is how it started," Susan said. but you could have paid it and moved on. Instead, you fought back, and that gave the rest of us the courage to do the same. That matters." I did not know what to say to that, so I just nodded. Susan patted my shoulder and headed out to her car. That night, I sat in my backyard, fire burning in the Chimenea, and reflected on the past 2.5 years. It had been a wild ride, from that first night when the cops showed up to the trial and sentencing, and finally to the reforms that were now in place. The neighborhood was in a good place, and I was in a good place. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I did not recognize. I opened it and read, "Mr. Anderson, this is Olivia Grant from Channel 8 News. We are doing a story on HOA reform and would love to interview you about your experience. Would you be interested?" I thought about it for a moment. Part of me wanted to just put the whole thing behind me and move on with my life. But another part of me recognized that sharing the story might help other people dealing with similar situations. If my experience could prevent even one other person from being victimized by a corrupt HOA board, it would be worth the time. I texted back, "Sure, I would be happy to talk." The interview was scheduled for the following week at my house. Olivia Grant turned out to be a sharp, professional journalist in her early 30s who had been following HOA issues in the Las Vegas area for years. She brought a cameraman and a producer, and they set up in my backyard with the Chimenea in the background. "So tell me," Olivia said once the camera was rolling, "when did you first realize something was wrong with your HOA?" I told her the story, starting with the fire pit and the police call, and moving through the escalating fines, the discovery of the embezzlement, and the eventual trial and conviction. Olivia asked good questions, digging into the details and getting me to explain not just what happened but how it felt to go through it. "What advice would you give to homeowners dealing with difficult HOAs?" she asked. "Document everything," I said immediately. "Take photos, keep copies of all correspondence, save emails, record dates and times. If you do not have documentation, it is your word against theirs. Also, talk to your neighbors. Chances are if you are being targeted, others are too. There is strength in numbers." "And what about the Chimenea?" Olivia asked with a slight smile. "That seems like it became a symbol of your resistance." I glanced at the Chimenea sitting behind me. "I guess it did. I was not trying to make a statement. I was just trying to find a way to enjoy fires in my backyard without violating what the HOA president claimed were the rules." But yeah, I suppose it became more than that. It became a reminder that there are usually creative solutions to problems if you are willing to look for them. The segment aired 2 weeks later during the evening news. It was about 5 minutes long, edited down from the hour-long interview, but it hit the key points. The station also did a follow-up piece on HOA reform efforts in Nevada, featuring interviews with state legislators and officials from the real estate division. After the segment aired, I got messages from dozens of people sharing their own HOA horror stories. Some were dealing with power-hungry board members like Patty. Others were facing arbitrary fines or selective enforcement of rules. A few had suspicions about financial misconduct, but did not know how to prove it. I tried to respond to as many as I could, offering advice and pointing people toward resources like forensic accountants and real estate attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes. It was overwhelming at times, but it also felt good to be able to help people who were going through what I had gone through. One message in particular stood out. It was from a man named Thomas Allen who lived in a different Henderson neighborhood. He was facing almost the exact same situation I had faced, complete with a vindictive HOA president and questionable fines. He asked if we could meet for coffee to talk about strategies. We met at a Starbucks on Stephanie Street, and I spent 2 hours walking him through everything I had learned. I gave him Jessica Turner's contact information, explained how to request financial records, and encouraged him to connect with his neighbors to see if he was the only target. "I cannot thank you enough," Thomas said as we were wrapping up. I was starting to think I was crazy, like maybe I was overreacting, but hearing your story makes me realize this is a real problem. "You are not crazy," I assured him, "and you are not overreacting. Trust your gut, document everything, and do not back down." A few months later, Thomas sent me a message letting me know that he and several neighbors had successfully recalled their HOA board and instituted reforms similar to what we had done in Willowbrook Estates. His HOA president had not been embezzling, as far as they could tell, but had been using her position to harass people she did not like. The reforms put an end to that. It was gratifying to know that my experience was helping others, but it was also frustrating that these problems were so widespread. HOAs were supposed to protect property values and maintain community standards, not become tools for petty tyrants to abuse their neighbors. As time went on, life continued to settle into a comfortable routine. I got a promotion at work, started dating a woman named Rachel who lived across town, and continued to host regular gatherings in my backyard. The Chimenea remained a fixture, used nearly every weekend from October through April when the weather was cool enough to enjoy outdoor fires. Patty Montgomery faded into memory, a cautionary tale we would occasionally reference, but not someone who occupied much mental space anymore. The neighborhood had moved on, and so had I. Then, about 3 years after Patty's sentencing, I got a strange phone call. It was from a lawyer representing Patty, asking if I would be willing to write a letter supporting her application for early release. She had apparently been a model prisoner, completed various rehabilitation programs, and was eligible for parole. I politely declined. The lawyer pressed, explaining that letters of support from victims and community members could make a big difference in parole hearings. I remained firm in my refusal. While I did not wish Patty any specific harm, I also was not going to help her get out of prison early. She had stolen from the community, harassed numerous residents, and abused her position of authority. She could serve her full sentence as far as I was concerned. The parole hearing happened without my involvement, and Patty's application was denied. She would serve at least another year before being eligible to apply again. Life moved on. Rachel and I got more serious, and eventually she moved into my house in Willowbrook Estates. She loved the neighborhood and the sense of community, and she became a regular host of Chimenea gatherings alongside me. We talked about getting married, maybe starting a family. One evening, sitting around the Chimenea with Rachel and several neighbors, someone asked me if I ever regretted buying the house given everything that had happened. "Not for a second," I said honestly. "This place is home. And yeah, dealing with Patty was awful, but look at what came out of it. The neighborhood is better. People stood up for themselves. We created real change. I would go through it all again if I had to." Rachel squeezed my hand. "I am glad you are stubborn," she said with a smile. "Stubborn?" I protested in mock offense. "I prefer principled." Everyone laughed, and the conversation moved on to other topics. But later that night, after everyone had gone home and Rachel had gone to bed, I sat outside alone for a while, watching the last embers glow in the Chimenea. I thought about that first night when the police showed up, how angry and confused I had been. I thought about all the stress and frustration that followed, the meetings and hearings and legal proceedings. I thought about discovering the embezzlement and the decision to pursue criminal charges rather than just trying to recover the money civilly. It had been exhausting and time-consuming and expensive, but it had also been necessary. And in the end, justice had been served, reforms had been implemented, and a community had been strengthened. The Chimenea had long since cooled, but I left it sitting there in its stone patio, a monument to the principle that sometimes you have to fight for what is right, even when it would be easier to just give in. Sometimes you have to be willing to switch to a Chimenea, to find creative solutions and refuse to be bullied. As I finally headed inside, I took one last look at the Chimenea silhouetted against the night sky. Tomorrow there would be another fire, another gathering, another evening of friends and neighbors coming together. That was worth fighting for. That was worth everything. The house was quiet as I locked the door and set the alarm. Rachel was asleep upstairs and the neighborhood was peaceful. This was home, and it was exactly where I wanted to be. No corrupt HOA president, no matter how determined, had been able to take that away from me, and that made all the difference.